Welcome to this trip through one of Georgia's most disturbing cases ever. Before we start, please let us know in the comments where you are and what time you are hearing this narration. We want to know where and when these documented stories are read. The first strange thing to happen in Wilkes County, Georgia, was recorded on the evening of the 28th of October, 1839. A document that has turned yellow with age and is almost impossible to read because of water damage shows that Sheriff Thomas Calloway was called to the Ashford Plantation, which is about 7 miles east of Washington, Georgia. The document, which was found during renovations to the courthouse in 1958, only briefly mentions a domestic disturbance that needed help. The most interesting thing about this record is not what it says, but what was later crossed out with thick black ink, a line that said, "Concerning the disappearance of Negro D." In 1839, Wilkes County was known for its large cotton farms and the rising tensions that would eventually lead to civil war. Colonel William Ashford, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who had been given the land for his service, built the Ashford Plantation in the late 1700s. It was one of the oldest estates in the area. Mary Ashford, a 37-year-old widow who had inherited the plantation after her husband's death 3 years earlier, owned it all by 1839. County records show that when James Ashford died in 1836, there were 43 enslaved people living on the plantation. Daniel Crow was one of them. The estate's inventory lists him as one male Negro, age 36, skilled carpenter and overseer, valued at $1,200. What the inventory doesn't say is that Daniel had a wife named Sarah who was also enslaved on the plantation. They were allowed to live together in a cabin away from the other enslaved people, which was an unusual arrangement that would later become important to the mystery. In Georgia, the fall of 1839 was colder than usual. Several people from different counties wrote in their journals about how early frosts hurt the late cotton harvests. Mary Ashford started to change things around the house during this cold snap. Elizabeth Willoughby, the wife of the local doctor, wrote in her journal, "Mrs. A has taken to strange habits following her period of mourning. She has moved the Negro carpenter to the main house, citing a need for extensive repairs. Many find this highly improper, though she dismisses all concerns." What Elizabeth Willoughby could not have known, what no one in Washington society could have suspected, was that this seemingly innocuous decision would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately be buried from official record for more than a century. The main house on the Ashford Plantation was on a small hill that looked out over fields that went all the way to the distant tree line of oak and pine. It was built in the Georgian style, with symmetrical windows and a wide central hallway. It gave the impression of wealth and order. James Ashford put up the white columns that hold up the front portico just before he died. It was his last attempt to show off the family's wealth. There was a row of cabins behind the house, past the kitchen garden and smokehouse. Most of the enslaved people lived there. The cabin where Daniel and Sarah Crow had lived for almost 10 years was the only one standing alone near a small stream. The enslaved people could go to church on Sundays at a small church on the edge of the property. The minister's records from 1839 show that attendance was going up all summer, but by October he wrote about troubling absence of certain members of Mrs. Ashford's household. The same record also said that prayers have been requested for Sarah, who is taken ill with a wasting disease. Dr. Richard Willoughby's medical ledger, which is only partially preserved in the Washington Historical Society archives, has an entry dated November 2nd, 1839, called to Ashford Plantation to attend a female Negro with consumption. Condition poor. Advised removal to drier quarters. Mrs. Ashford declined recommendation. A later entry, dated November 12th, simply says, "Patient expired. No further visits required." Daniel Crow became a widower when Sarah died. The county death records only say, "Negro woman, property of M. Ashford, buried on plantation grounds." They don't give a name, just a sale of property. After Sarah died, people in the area started to notice changes at the Ashford Plantation. Nancy Wilkinson, whose family owned the property next door, wrote to her sister in Augusta, "Mary has fired her house slaves and now only relies on the carpenter. They eat together, according to my cook, who heard it from their stable boy. I can't imagine what has possessed her to act this way." James would be horrified. The letter goes on to say that Mary Ashford had started to turn down invitations to social events and that the plantation seemed to be withdrawing from county life. Nancy wrote, "The gates are still closed. When I called to pay my respects, a young black girl told me that the mistress was sick and not seeing any visitors. I saw a man move through the parlor window, and he was too tall to be any of the house servants I remembered." By December 1839, people in Washington were starting to talk about things. On December 15th, Reverend Hiram Parker gave a sermon in which he condemned improper relations that violate both divine and man's law and called for Christians to step in when a soul may have strayed dangerously from the path of righteousness. He didn't name names, but church records show that Mary Ashford hadn't been to services for 3 weeks in a row. Sheriff Calloway's log says that on the night of December 23rd, a group of 12 men from well-known families in Wilkes County came to the Ashford plantation. The official record only says that they came to talk about community concern regarding the management of the estate. What happened that night is not written down in any official document, but there are bits and pieces of private letters that paint a disturbing picture. Thomas Wilkinson wrote to his brother in Charleston on the 2nd of January, 1840, and said, "The matter with the Ashford widow has been addressed. We found conditions as rumored, though worse than imagined. The offending party has been removed. Mary remains under the care of the Reverend's wife. The doctor has been called twice. She speaks little, but continues to ask after her husband. Not James, mind you. The property will likely pass to James's cousin from Savannah once matters are settled. What happened to Daniel Crow? There is no record of a death. There is no record of a sale. After the 23rd of December, 1839, he is no longer mentioned in any official records." Mary Ashford was sent to the Georgia State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum in Milledgeville in January 1840. The commitment papers, which Dr. Willoughby signed and Reverend Parker signed, say she was morally insane and had delusions about her social position and relationships. She stayed there until she died 17 months later. The official cause was brain fever, but records from the asylum show that she stopped eating in the last weeks of her life. James's cousin, William Ashford of Savannah, did get the Ashford plantation. He sold most of the enslaved people there and then sold the property itself before going back to Savannah in 1843. The main house burned down in 1847. Later, the land was divided into smaller farms. For almost 100 years, the story of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crow was hidden away in old papers and family gossip. If it weren't for Dr. Eleanor Tanner, a historian at the University of Georgia who was studying race relations before the Civil War in 1954, it might have stayed that way. At first, Dr. Tanner's discovery was innocent enough. She was looking through court records for cases that had to do with the legal status of enslaved people when she found a partial transcript of a closed county hearing from January 1840. The document was about what would happen to the Ashford estate and included testimony from several witnesses. There was a lot of procedural stuff, but something Nancy Wilkinson said caught her attention. "I think Mary's mind broke when she found out that Daniel had been meeting with Sarah in secret. After Sarah died, she thought he was now really hers." Dr. Tanner searched through private collections and family papers because of this fragment. He eventually got his hands on the Willoughby family documents, which had been given to the Atlanta Historical Society but had not yet been cataloged. She found Elizabeth Willoughby's full journal there, and the entries were much more detailed than the public records that had been cleaned up. Elizabeth's private writings say that Mary Ashford did bring Daniel Crow into the main house after her husband died, at first to do repairs as a handyman, but their relationship changed over time. Elizabeth wrote on the 12th of September, 1839, "R. came back from Ashford Plantation very upset. He says Mary no longer calls D. her servant, but instead calls him Mr. Crow in private. She has given him James's clothes and watches him get dressed every morning. R is worried that she has lost her mind completely. But what worries him more is that the man seems to accept this arrangement. Elizabeth's journal suggests that Daniel Crow's involvement was not voluntary, but forced. She wrote, R thinks the man is worried about his wife's safety. Mary moved the sick woman to the damp storage cellar, saying it would stop the spread of the disease. But R has told her many times that this will only make the consumption worse. When D objects, she threatens to sell his wife to the traders going west. The entry from the 31st of October, 1839, is the most upsetting. Mary came to call today, bringing D with her. She introduced him as my husband, Daniel, and spoke of their plans to travel north in the spring. When I expressed shock, she became agitated, insisting that they had been properly married and that God Himself had blessed their union. D stood silently, eyes downcast. When Mary stepped away to admire my new curtains, he whispered, My Sarah still lives. Please send help. Before I could respond, Mary returned and they departed promptly. Sarah died less than 2 weeks later. Elizabeth's journal records what happened after Sarah died with growing horror. Mary now keeps D chained at night. She wrote on December 1, R saw the marks on his ankles when he was called to treat a fever at the plantation. The other slaves are terrified, speaking of how the mistress has taken to parading D through the quarters, announcing him as master of the estate. She has had him whip any who refuse to acknowledge him as such. The journal entries grow increasingly disturbed as Elizabeth recounts stories brought back by her husband and the house servants. She writes about how Mary made Daniel read to her from James's books every night, dressed him in her dead husband's clothes, and introduced him as Mr. Ashford to the few visitors she still had. She has made a horrible puppet show, Elizabeth wrote, with D as the unwilling performer. The entry for the 24th of December 1839 is the most telling. R came back at dawn, clothes dirty, and hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his tea. They found D in the master bedroom, chained to the bedpost. Mary had dressed him in James's wedding clothes. The things R described, I cannot bear to write down. The men took D to the old mill. R would not tell me what happened, only that justice was served as required. They brought Mary to our house after. She alternates between calling for James and for Daniel, seeming not to know the difference any longer. Her hands are bloodied from clawing at R. When they separated her from D, she keeps asking when her husband will be returned to her. Dr. Tanner's research paper, which would have shown what happened, was never published. University records show that her funding was suddenly cut off in 1958, and she was offered a job at a small college in Oregon. It is said that her collected materials were lost in the mail. The only thing left of her work is a short abstract she sent in for a conference presentation that was later canceled. Workers found human bones near the site of the old mill in 1968 while building a highway that went through part of the old Ashford lands. The county's records show that the bones were very old, so they were put back in the Washington Town Cemetery without any more investigation. There was no marker. People in Wilkes County say that the old Ashford property is cursed. Farmers who later worked the land said that tools went missing, there were cold spots that didn't make sense even in the summer, and they always felt like they were being watched. One story from 1942 tells of a tenant farmer's child who said they saw a tall man in old-fashioned clothes standing at the edge of the field. The man would walk a few steps before disappearing. Some older people in Washington still say that on some autumn nights, especially as the first frost approaches, you can hear chains near the creek where Sarah and Daniel's cabin used to be. Some people think these stories are just superstitions that people use to make sense of the uncomfortable history that lies beneath the surface of their community. The tale of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crow exemplifies one of the numerous overlooked atrocities in American history. Not supernatural fears, but the inherent human propensity for obsession, possession, and cruelty. It talks about how power corrupts, how being alone can change the way you think, and how systems of oppression make people suffer in ways that are both unique and horrible. It is perhaps most disturbing how well this history was erased, how powerful people could literally rewrite the story, remove names from records, send inconvenient witnesses to asylums, and make sure that certain stories went untold for generations. In 1961, a historian named Marcus Collins tried to build on Dr. Tanner's work. His notes, which are now in the University of Georgia archives, include this last entry. I am convinced that the leading families of Wilkes County deliberately hid what happened at the Ashford plantation. Their descendants still hold positions of power. My inquiries are increasingly met with closed doors and veiled threats. Some stories, it seems, are not meant to be told, and maybe he was right. But the truth has a way of sticking around, like in broken documents, whispered stories, and the uneasy feeling you get when you walk on certain patches of ground. We may never know the whole story of the widow who took her slave's husband as her own, but it still echoes across the Georgia countryside. It reminds us that the scariest monsters aren't supernatural beings, but regular people with power who are willing to use it without mercy. The signs are still there for those who know where to look. The creek where Sarah and Daniel lived is still cold and clear. The hilltop where the main house used to be is still empty because the people who bought it after that didn't want to build there. There is a wedding picture of James Ashford from 1,829 inches, the Washington Historical Society. It is carefully kept, but not often shown. People who have seen it sometimes talk about the shadow in the background, which looks like a tall figure that the artist started to paint, but then covered up with dark pigment. People who know the story might wonder if it means something else. Maybe a premonition of the man who would unwillingly take James's place in his widow's disturbed mind and pay the highest price for a role he never wanted. Society volunteers say it's a common painting technique of the time. The past is never really gone. It just waits patiently and persistently beneath the surface until someone digs deep enough to find it. In 1963, Catherine Mercer, a graduate student, found something strange while sorting through donations to the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. One of William Ashford's great-granddaughter's personal items was a small leather-bound book with brittle pages. At first, it was thought to be a household ledger, but a closer look showed that it was something much more disturbing. A diary belonging to Mary Ashford that ran from June 1838 to December 1839. The diary somehow survived the fire on the plantation, probably because William Ashford took it with him when he took over the estate. It's not clear why he kept it instead of getting rid of such incriminating evidence. He might have kept it as a warning for future generations, or as a way to get back at the families who took matters into their own hands that December night. Catherine's discovery should have been a big deal in history, but the Society's board of directors took the diary out of the collection just a few days after she first looked at it. Catherine was told that the item had material inappropriate for public consumption and that she would have to change her research focus to something else. When she complained, her academic advisor told her that pursuing the matter further could hurt her chances of getting a good job in the future. The diary itself went to private people, but Catherine had already copied several pages into her research notes. These pieces, which were given to a small library in Athens, Georgia, in 1987 after Catherine's death, are the only known direct evidence of Mary Ashford's declining mental health. The first entry, from the 12th of June 1838, starts out innocently enough. Daniel finished fixing the east wing today. His craftsmanship is better than that of any white carpenter in the county. James always said he had great hands. I find myself watching those hands as he works, remembering how James would praise them. By August, the entries have a more disturbing tone. Daniel looks like James in some lights. I noticed it today as he stood by the window installing the new molding. The way he holds himself, the set of his shoulders when he concentrates, his brow furrows just like James's did. I asked him to stay in that position so I could watch it longer. He seemed confused, but did what I asked. September 3rd. I had Daniel try on James's waistcoat today. It fit surprisingly well, but the sleeves were a little short. He didn't want to do it at first. But I reminded him that I was being nice by letting his wife stay in their private cabin even though she couldn't work. He is learning to be grateful for my kindness. October 17th. Sarah's cough gets worse. Daniel has been distracted and is asked to take care of her instead of doing his chores around the house. I reminded him that his main duty is to me now. The others talk behind my back, but I know they are whispering about the new plans. They will learn to accept them in time. November 1st. Daniel tried to leave the house tonight after I went to bed. I heard him walking down the stairs and saw that he was dressed, clearly planning to go back to Sarah. I told him that a husband should be in his wife's bed, not sneaking around in the dark. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were full of hate. I've had Johnson lock the doors and windows. Daniel will understand that this is best for everyone in the end. November 13th. The day after Sarah died, Daniel cried today. I let him do it for a while. Then I told him that Providence had just taken away an obstacle to our happiness. He got very upset and needed to be held back. Dr. W gave him a sedative, saying that it was shock and grief that were making him so ungrateful. I've moved Daniel to the master bedroom so I can keep a better eye on him. The chains are only temporary until he accepts his new position. The last entry, dated the 22nd of December, 1839, is the most disturbing. We are husband and wife in all but documentation, and even that can be arranged with enough money. Daniel spoke my name today, without prompting, and accepted James's ring on his finger. Progress comes slowly, but it comes. Tonight, we shall consummate what God has ordained. I've explained that his former life is no more, that he is now Daniel Ashford, master of this plantation, alongside his loving wife. The others watch with resentment, but they will obey or be sold. I hear horses approaching. Late visitors are most unwelcome. The entry ends abruptly, presumably interrupted by the arrival of the 12 men from prominent families who would forever change the course of events at the Ashford plantation. What makes Mary's diary so disturbing is that it not only records her descent into obsession, but also the cold, clinical way she talks about what she does. There is no admission of guilt, and Daniel's humanity and ability to act are not recognized. In her warped view of the world, she was just taking what she thought was rightfully hers. In 1965, workers who were fixing up an old building in Washington that used to be the county records office found a hidden compartment behind a brick wall. There was a metal box inside, with a few papers that looked like they had been hidden on purpose. One of them was a partial transcript of an unofficial hearing that Sheriff Calloway held on the 2nd of January, 1840. The document is in bad shape because of water and time, and it has broken up statements from a number of people who were at the Ashford plantation on December 23. One quote, which is said to be from Thomas Wilkinson, says that he found the Negro Daniel chained to the bed, dressed in the clothes of the late Mr. Ashford, with the widow in a state of undress beside him. When we asked her about it, she called him her husband and got angry when we tried to separate them. Another part of Dr. Richard Willoughby's report says, upon examination, the Negro man exhibited numerous injuries consistent with prolonged restraint and clear evidence of psychological torment. He alternated between periods of complete silence and agitation, particularly when the widow called his name. The most revealing testimony comes from Johnson, identified as the Ashford plantation's head house servant. Mistress changed after Master James died. At first, just small things, having Daniel eat at the kitchen table instead of the quarters, giving him better clothes. Then she moved Sarah to the cellar, even though we all knew it would make her sickness worse. Daniel tried to help Sarah, but Mistress would punish him if he spent too long away from the house. After Sarah passed, Mistress made him wear Master James's clothes, made us all call him Master Daniel. At night, we could hear text missing. Those who objected were whipped or sold. We knew it wasn't right, but who would believe us over a white woman? Sheriff Calloway's summary at the end of the transcript says, given the sensitive nature of the events and the standing of all parties involved, this court finds it in the best interest of the county that no official record be made of the proceedings, the Negro Daniel having been dealt with according to the judgment of the assembled men and Mrs. Ashford now being in the care of medical professionals. This matter is considered resolved. This document is ordered sealed. When these hidden records were found, local authorities looked into them for a short time. However, by 1965, Most of the people directly involved had already died. The papers were sent to the state archives in Atlanta, where they were cataloged, but mostly forgotten, a footnote in Georgia's complicated history of race. But in 1967, the story found an unexpected supporter when Eliza Crow, a school teacher from Albany, New York, started looking into her family's past. She found possible links to an ancestor named Daniel who had gone missing from records around 1840 by tracing her family tree back to freed slaves from Georgia. She ended up in Wilkes County, where her first questions were met with polite but firm resistance. Eliza didn't give up and kept looking. She went to historical societies, church archives, and university collections all over Georgia. She found a short entry from 1,839 inches, the records of a small Baptist church near the old Ashford plantation. It listed Brother Daniel and Sister Sarah, servants of the Ashford estate, as members of the church. A note in the margin said, "Pray for them as they go through hard times." What Eliza found next would be very important for understanding the whole tragedy. In the archives of the University of Georgia, she found letters from Richard Willoughby to his brother in Baltimore from February 1840. The doctor wrote, "I can't sleep because of what we did at the mill. The law would say justice was served, but I can't find peace in it." The Negro man was not a willing participant in Mary's madness. That much was clear from his condition when we found him. But the others would not listen to reason. Their only concern was preserving the social order, not justice or mercy. May God forgive what I failed to prevent. This letter suggests that Daniel Crow was not an accomplice in breaking social taboos, but rather a victim, first of Mary Ashford's psychological torment, and then of the vigilante justice of 12 prominent men who were unwilling to acknowledge his victimhood because of his race and status. Eliza's research resulted in a concise volume released by a minor publishing house in 1969 titled Silenced Lives, Race, Power, and Justice in Antebellum, Georgia. Even though mainstream historians didn't pay much attention to her work, it was preserved and eventually recognized as important for understanding how systems of power based on race, gender, and class could create conditions for terrible abuse that could then be erased from official history. In 1974, an older woman named Margaret Wilson got in touch with the Wilkes County Historical Society to make an unusual donation. Her grandfather was a carpenter who was in charge of taking down the Ashford Mill in 1882. Workers found a small tin box hidden in the mill's foundation while they were tearing it down. Inside was a hand-carved wooden figure of a woman holding a child, along with a folded piece of paper with a message written in barely legible handwriting, "Sarah and our child that never was." Daniel Crow, his mark, 1839. Margaret's grandfather had kept the item and passed it down through the family. Its importance wasn't fully understood until Margaret read a newspaper article about Eliza Crow's research. The carving is now on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it serves as a physical link to lives that powerful people tried to erase from history. But the most terrifying piece of evidence may have come to light in 1978, when renovations at the old Georgia State Lunatic Asylum uncovered patient records that had been hidden behind walls during previous construction. Mary Ashford's file was one of them. It had session notes from Dr. Ora Stillman, who took care of her for 17 months at the institution. Dr. Stillman's notes showed that Mary never admitted to doing anything wrong. She always said she had been widowed twice, first when James died, and then when they took my Daniel from me. The most disturbing entries are from her last few weeks. Patient continues to insist that she can hear chains at night, claims Daniel is still bound, waiting for me to release him. Refuses food, stating she must join him properly this time. Physical restraint continues to be necessary as she attempts to harm herself with any available implement. The final entry, dated May 28, 1841, reads simply, "Patient expired at 3:17 a.m. In her final moments, she became suddenly lucid, asking, "Is he waiting for me?" Before an answer could be provided, she suffered a seizure and could not be revived. Burial to be arranged as per agreement with W. Ashford of Savannah. No ceremony requested. The landscape of Wilkes County has changed a lot in the 200 years since the events at the Ashford plantation. Cotton fields have been replaced by other crops, then by buildings and highways. The stream that used to run by Daniel and Sarah's cabin has been changed so that it can better meet the needs of today. A man-made lake built in the 1950 seconds to make hydroelectric power now covers the site of the mill where Daniel probably died. But the story lives on, not as a ghost story with clanking chains and ghostly figures, but as something perhaps more disturbing. A reminder of how power can corrupt absolutely, how privilege can hide the worst abuses from view, and how easily the suffering of those deemed lesser can be erased from official records. Dr. Jerome Watson, a historian who specializes in antebellum Georgia, wrote in a 1997 analysis, "The case of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crow represents a unique inversion of established power dynamics that was ultimately corrected through extrajudicial violence. What makes this case remarkable is not that such abuses occurred, they were tragically common, but that the particular circumstances created documentary evidence that survived, despite coordinated efforts to suppress it. For every such story that has emerged, countless others remain buried, their victims denied even the dignity of being remembered. People who know the story sometimes stop by the old cemetery where Mary Ashford was buried in an unmarked grave, or walk along the lake shore where the mill site used to be. Some people leave flowers or small gifts near the place where Sarah and Daniel's cabin used to be. It is a quiet recognition of the lives that were affected by a tragedy caused by obsession, oppression, and the terrible unfairness of the world they lived in. A small plaque in the county courthouse, put up in 2002, honors those whose stories were left out of official records but live on in memory and truth. It also points out that historical records are not complete. It doesn't say anything about the Ashford plantation, but people who know the research know how important it is. The most recent event happened in 2009, when ground-penetrating radar was used to look at the area where the Ashford plantation house used to be. Researchers found proof of a cellar that had never been documented before under what would have been the east wing. This was the part that Daniel was fixing when Mary first noticed how much he looked like her late husband. Excavation uncovered a small room with strange features. Iron rings set into the stone walls and floor, a narrow window that was too small to escape through, and scratches in the soft mortar that looked like words or tallies. Carbon dating of organic material found in the cellar shows that it was used a lot in the late 1830 seconds. One of the things that was found was a silver button with the initials J.A. on it, which probably came from one of James Ashford's clothes. We don't know how it got into this secret room, but it seems to connect the room directly to the events described in the broken historical record. Archaeological research showed that the cellar had been changed on purpose to hold people, not just for a short time as punishment for enslaved people, but for a long time. This physical proof backs up the most troubling stories in Elizabeth Willoughby's journal and Mary's own diary. Now, the land where the Ashford plantation used to be is split up into several properties. The current owners know different amounts about its past. Some people welcome it, letting researchers and descendants visit to pay their respects or do research. Some people would rather not talk about the property's dark past and instead focus on its agricultural history or architectural importance. This tension between remembering and forgetting, between facing uncomfortable truths and keeping more palatable stories, is similar to the bigger problem of historical memory in the American South. The narrative of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crow occupies a contentious realm, sufficiently documented to prevent total erasure, yet too disconcerting to be wholly integrated into the regional identity. The most appropriate memorial may not originate from official markers or academic literature, but rather from an oral tradition that has emerged within certain local families. They talk about telling Daniel's story as a way to bear witness, recognizing that what happened was seen, even if those who saw it couldn't do anything about it or were involved in covering it up. The telling becomes a kind of delayed justice, making sure that the truth lives on, no matter how painful it is. In the end, the horror of what happened at the Ashford plantation in the fall and winter of 1839 is not due to supernatural elements or Gothic trappings, but rather its terrifying plausibility. It is horrifying to think that when power operates without accountability, when obsession meets opportunity, and when society values some lives more than others, the conditions exist for atrocities that can then be buried almost without a trace. The story serves as a reminder that history is more than just what is written down in official records. It also includes what is left out of those records, like family stories, local legends, and unexplained gaps that need to be looked into more closely. It makes us think about who has been left out of the stories we tell, and why. As night falls over the Georgia countryside and the wind blows through the tall pine trees that Mary, Daniel, and Sarah walked under, their story still has an impact. Not to scare people with a ghost story, but to remind them of how cruel and strong people can be, and of our duty to remember even the histories that others have tried to erase. In remembering, we not only acknowledge what was lost, but also what continues to exist despite all attempts to suppress it. The fundamental humanity of those who lived, suffered, loved, and endured in circumstances that history sought to silence, yet still resonate with those who are receptive.